She was cast out in the dead of winter, her dignity stripped before a crowd that chose silence over compassion. For children clung to her, shivering not just from the biting cold, but from the jagged grief that settled deep in their bones. He was a man of few words, a single father weathered by solitude, never one to expect miracles, until the miracle knocked on his door wearing threadbare boots and carrying everything she had left in the world. If tales of quiet bravery, redemption, and the healing touch of kindness stir your soul, stay with me. What unfolded next would change everything for her, for him, and for a small, snowbound town that forgot how to care. Let me take you back to the snow-blanketed morning when it all began. The snow fell heavier than usual over Pine Hollow that morning. The sky sagged low and gray. The trees hunched beneath weighty blankets of white. The mountain town, small and tight-lipped, spoke in murmurs on ordinary days. But today, even whispers seemed to freeze midair. The church bells had stopped tolling only minutes before, the last note still trembling on the wind, but the crowd lingered in the courtyard, as though unsure how to leave grief behind. Evie Langford stood at the center of it all like a lone pine in a blizzard, weathered, upright, and utterly alone. Her black coat was far too thin for January. In one arm, she cradled her youngest, barely 3 years old. Her other hand gripped the tiny fingers of her older 3, 10, 8, and 6, all of them wide-eyed, trembling not from frost, but from confusion, as if the ground beneath them had shifted and no one had told them how to stand. They had just buried Mark Langford, her husband, their father, a man many called troubled, and some whispered was cruel, gone far too soon, and not soon enough, depending on which Langford you asked. "You should have left years ago," Dolores Langford hissed, her voice slicing through the hush like a blade. Mark's mother stood stiff and vindictive, her gloved finger jabbing the air toward Evie, as if casting a curse. "You poisoned my boy. Now he's in the ground, and we're left with this." She waved a disdainful hand toward the children. No one moved. No one dared speak. Some turned their faces. A woman dabbed her eyes, though whether from grief or guilt, who could say? "I don't want to hear another word," Dolores barked. "You're not family anymore. Take your bastards and go. You're not welcome here. Not in the house. Not in town. Not even in memory." The words cracked like a whip. Evie didn't flinch. She didn't cry. Not in front of her children. She only pulled them closer. The baby whimpered, pressing his wet cheek to her collarbone. "But, Grandma," her 6-year-old whispered, stepping forward. Dolores's face twisted. "Don't call me that," she snapped, voice brittle like shattering glass. And in that moment, something terrible and silent passed between the town and the mother left out in the cold. Compassion died, and no one dared speak its name. Evie's oldest son looked up at her. "Mom," he said, quiet and stunned, "why does everyone hate us?" She swallowed hard, 1,000 truths clawing at her throat. But she couldn't answer, not without breaking. Then, from across the parking lot, a low rumble broke the silence. A battered old Ford pickup, paint flaking and missing a side mirror, pulled up just past the church steps. Snow curled around its tires as it stopped. The engine cut. The door creaked open, and out stepped a man. Tall, rugged. His coat was patched, jeans worn, hair tucked under a fraying knit beanie. Many didn't recognize him. Others had simply chosen to forget. Miles Rohr, the reclusive single father who lived out past the tree line, where no one went unless they were desperate or lost. He didn't rush, but he walked with quiet purpose, straight through the stunned crowd, through the cold stares and whispered judgment, and he stopped beside Evie. He looked once at the children, for small souls, clinging to the only world they had left. Then he turned his gaze to Dolores. "You done?" he asked, his voice low, steady. Dolores recoiled slightly, not from fear, but from being seen. "This doesn't concern you," she snapped. Miles didn't flinch. "Looks to me like you're tossing 4 kids into a snowbank after a funeral. That concerns everyone. Don't you judge me." "I'm not," he said, his voice as calm as snow. "Just noticing no one else is stepping up." Charles Langford stepped forward now, cheeks pink with cold and some deeper, hotter shame. "This is our family's business. You don't get to interfere." Miles turned to him, gaze unblinking. "Funny thing, family. Supposed to protect its own. I see a mother clinging to her children while the rest of you act like they're stray dogs." A murmur stirred the air. Someone coughed. No one spoke. "I know what it's like," Miles continued, voice softer now. "To be looked at like you don't belong. To raise a child alone, with more silence than help." Evie hadn't spoken. Not one word. Her lips were blue, her hand stiff with cold. Miles stepped closer. "You got somewhere to go." She shook her head barely. He peeled off his outer coat, wool-lined, heavy, and wrapped it around her shoulders like a vow. "Then you're coming with me." Dolores gasped. "You can't just take them." Miles raised a brow. "You just told them to leave. Or is your cruelty just for show?" That final blow landed with the weight of truth. Dolores's breath caught. For the first time in years, she looked at those children, not as burdens, but as something else. Her lip trembled. She turned away. Charles reached for her, but she shrugged him off and climbed into their waiting SUV. Doors slammed. Silence followed. Miles turned to the children. "I've got one room. It's not much, but it's warm. You'll be safe." They nodded, one by one, like they already believed him. Evie looked up at the man who had just given her more than shelter. He had returned her dignity. "Thank you," she whispered. Miles didn't smile. He only nodded. "Let's get out of the cold." As they walked toward the truck, Evie's 6-year-old daughter slipped her small hand into Eli's, Miles's quiet, wide-eyed son waiting in the back seat. That was the first miracle. Not the rescue, not the ride, but that tiny hand reaching out, across loss, across silence, to begin a family that had no reason to exist except for kindness. Snow fell silently as the truck crept down the mountain road, its engine a hum beneath the hush. In the cab, no one spoke. Evie sat rigid in the passenger seat, Miles's coat wrapped around her like borrowed armor. Her children huddled in the back, nestled against Eli, who sat still as stone. They reached the edge of Pine Hollow's last plowed road and entered the woods. The forest closed around them like a guardian, curious, watchful. The cabin appeared suddenly, hidden in the trees. A small log structure patched with sheet metal, its roof sagging slightly under snow. Smoke rose from the crooked chimney, a tired breath into the winter air. Evie didn't flinch. She'd lived through worse. Miles shut off the engine. "We're here." She stepped out into knee-deep snow, legs numb through her skirt, and lifted her toddler to her hip. The others followed, hesitant, boots crunching. Inside it was warmer, but only just. A fire glowed low on the hearth. The room was small but clean. Homemade furniture, a threadbare rug, scattered toys. A book lay open on the couch, a pair of reading glasses resting beside it. Evie held her breath. The air smelled of pine, ash, and something faintly sweet, like cinnamon and old leather. Miles pointed to a door. "One bedroom with bunks. You take that. I'll sleep in the pantry." She tried to protest, but the words caught. She hadn't expected kindness. Not here. Not now. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, kicked off his boots, and vanished into the shadows. Later, they ate lentil soup from mismatched bowls. Eli sat quietly beside his father, tearing bread into perfect pieces. No one filled the silence. It wasn't the empty kind. Evie offered to wash the dishes. Miles nodded and stepped out into the snow with an axe. Through the frosted window, she watched him split wood under the moonlight. Steady, unhurried, every swing a promise to keep them warm. "Does he do that every night?" she asked Eli, who sat cross-legged by the fire. He nodded once, eyes dark and unreadable. When Miles came in, his hands raw from cold, he stacked the wood and fed the fire until it breathed again. "You didn't have to give us your room," Evie said, touching his sleeve. "I remember what it felt like," he said, "to need help and not get it." That night, as the children curled into unfamiliar beds and sleep finally found them, Evie stayed up, pencil in hand, sketching quietly. Shapes from memory. Fragments of a life that once felt whole. In the pantry, Miles lay on a cot too small for his frame, staring at the ceiling, listening to 5 new breaths in his house. 5 fragile reasons to keep the fire alive. And across the room, Eli sat near the fire, silently drawing. Every so often, he glanced toward the hallway, where names had yet to be exchanged, but where strangers were no longer strangers. Outside, the snow came again, soft and slow. And inside, a miracle unfolded, not all at once, but in breaths and firelight and kindness that asked for nothing in return. Evie cast a soft glance at the boy seated at the far end of the table, his silence wrapping around him like a second skin. He was sketching again, fine, delicate lines scratched carefully onto a folded piece of paper. She couldn't discern what he was drawing, but she noticed something subtle and significant. The tension in his narrow shoulders eased with each movement of his pencil, as though every stroke siphoned out a fragment of the weight he carried deep inside. "Does he talk?" she asked, her voice hushed with respect for the stillness. "Not often," Miles replied from the kitchen, his hands busy with breakfast preparations. "But he listens." Evie nodded, understanding. She recognized that kind of silence, the kind not born from fear or withdrawal but rooted in deep observation. Eli had the eyes of someone who saw too much, who had learned that some truths weren't meant for words. Moments later, the hallway came alive with sleepy footsteps and yawns. Children emerged, rubbing dreams from their eyes. Her daughter Maddie, dressed in mismatched flannel pajamas, was dragging a tangled ball of red yarn behind her like a beloved pet on a makeshift leash. Evie chuckled, her voice tinged with warmth. "Where'd you find that?" "In a drawer, under the sink," Maddie replied, holding up the yarn proudly. "It's kind of messy, but I like it." Evie recognized it instantly, a leftover from a project she had once started and abandoned. Maddie had always had a love for color, especially red. Her small fingers were already working the yarn into loops, instinctively weaving it between them. "Don't take too much of Mr. Miles's stuff," Evie reminded gently. "It's okay," Miles called over his shoulder. "Yarn's meant to be used." Maddie beamed and made her way to the table, plopping herself beside Eli as if she belonged there all along. Without hesitation, she placed the yarn between them and began to wrap it lightly around her fingers. Eli paused his drawing, but didn't pull away. Instead, he watched her hands, methodical, patient, mirroring the way her mother had once taught her to finger chain on cold nights when the heater failed and all they had were stories to keep them warm. In just a few minutes, she'd made a small red bracelet, tied off neatly at the end. She slid it across the table toward Eli. He stared at it, not moving, not speaking. Then, gently, he picked it up and held it in his palm as though weighing the invisible message inside. "Red means safe," Maddie whispered, still not looking at him. Eli blinked once, then carefully, slowly, slipped the bracelet over his wrist. From the stove, Miles watched the moment unfold, saying nothing, but he stirred the oatmeal a little more slowly. Later that morning, after breakfast, the children bundled up in borrowed coats and scarves, eager to explore the snow. Miles handed Evie a pair of boots and an extra scarf. "They're not pretty, but they'll keep you dry." Evie smiled, pulling them on. "Pretty's a luxury I gave up a long time ago." They stepped out into a world muffled by white. The snow crunched underfoot, and the trees stood like sentinels, silent, still, their limbs heavy with fresh powder. The children dove into the snow with joy, building a crooked snowman by the tree line. Maddie kept darting back and forth between the house and the yard, checking on Eli, who remained on the porch steps. His sketch pad rested in his lap, red yarn bracelet snug around his wrist, his pencil moving with uncharacteristic focus. "He's different with her," Evie observed quietly, standing beside Miles. "Yeah," Miles said. "She doesn't ask anything from him. That helps." Evie glanced at him. "You're good with silence." He shrugged. "I've had years of practice." There was no sadness in his voice, only a matter-of-fact weight to the words. Evie pulled the scarf tighter around her neck, fingers toying with the edge. I used to fill every silence, she said after a moment. Couldn't stand the quiet. Mark hated it. Miles said nothing. I stopped talking, she continued, her voice cracking on the edges. Not just to him. To everyone. Even the kids. I thought maybe if I stayed quiet, everything would stop falling apart. She hadn't realized her voice was trembling until the last word caught in her throat. Miles didn't rush to comfort her. No platitudes. No awkward pat on the shoulder. Just a stillness that felt like permission. Maybe falling apart is just the beginning of something better, he said quietly. Evie looked at him, eyes wide. You believe that? I have to. That night, Maddie insisted on teaching Eli how to finger chain the yarn. She handed him a new piece, this one purple, and demonstrated the looping motion over and over again until Eli's fingers, clumsy and hesitant, began to mimic hers. He didn't speak, but then something rare and precious happened. He laughed. A soft, startled sound, like someone learning to breathe again after nearly drowning. Evie heard it from the kitchen and nearly dropped the spoon she was stirring. Miles looked up too. He didn't smile, but his eyes, always so guarded, softened. Later, long after the children had gone to bed and the cabin had fallen into its quiet nighttime hush, Evie walked into the living room. On the windowsill, placed with care, was a red yarn bracelet and a small drawing. 7 stick figures stood in a row, a single red line looping above them, connecting them all. For as long as he could remember, Eli Rohr had drawn the world without faces. His people had hats, scarves, shadows, but never eyes, never mouths. Not because he lacked the skill, but because faces felt like lies. They moved. They judged. They vanished. So he drew trees. Steady. Quiet. Or shoes. People never paid attention to shoes. But something shifted that week. The bracelet still hugged his wrist, fraying slightly where his fingers had picked at it. He hadn't taken it off since Maddie gave it to him. Now, curled up in the warmest corner of the cabin, Eli stared at his latest drawing. 7 figures, holding hands, and this time faces. Maddie with her freckled grin, a tooth missing. Jamie with his mischievous eyes, always half squinting. The baby brother, curled thumb in his mouth. Their youngest sister, hair in wild pigtails. Their mother, Evie, with eyes full of exhaustion and kindness, like someone who'd cried and didn't want anyone to know. And then Miles, slightly apart, the hardest to draw, not blank but withheld, a face that had seen loss and decided to keep it private. And finally, Eli's own face, small at the edge, a question mark in the crowd. But this time, he gave himself a smile, the first in 8 long years. That morning, Evie nearly spilled her coffee when she saw the drawing taped to the fridge. She froze, breath caught in her throat, as her eyes traced each figure. When she reached her own face, real weary and honest, something cracked open in her chest. She touched the paper gently, as if it might dissolve under her fingers. Miles appeared behind her. He left it there for you. For me? She asked, voice unsteady. He only tapes them up when he wants someone to see. Evie's gaze rested on Eli's face in the drawing. He's smiling. Miles nodded. Yeah. Her eyes shimmered. Does he know what that means? I think he knows what it feels like. Outside, the children played in the snowy field. Jamie had fashioned a sled out of an old door and some scrap metal, and laughter echoed through the cold air. Eli watched from the steps, sketching still, but every now and then, when Maddie called his name, he looked up and waved. He didn't join them. Not yet. But the wave was new. And for now, that was enough. Evie stood by the window, arms wrapped in a faded quilt, eyes following the children. I used to think healing would sound like fireworks, she murmured. Loud. Celebratory. Miles stood beside her, hands tucked in his coat. This is quieter, but just as real. She nodded, then asked gently, Did Eli's mother draw? Miles hesitated. She painted. Watercolors. Soft landscapes. Faded edges. Where is she now? Gone. 6 years. Evie didn't ask more. Some absences filled a room louder than any words. That night, The fire cast a golden glow across the cabin. Evie sat at the kitchen table, a blank sketch pad open before her. The children were asleep. Miles was outside, stacking the last of the firewood. Her fingers traced lines without form, curves, angles, half-thoughts. Shapes of lives slowly stitching themselves back together. Eli appeared silently at her side. She looked up and smiled. "Can't sleep." He shook his head. She gestured to the chair across from her. He sat, placed his sketch pad on the table, and opened it. "I saw your picture," she said softly. He looked toward the fridge, then back down. It was beautiful. He hesitated, then turned the page. A new drawing. Just one figure. Her. Evie stared, stunned. It wasn't detailed, but it was her. The tired eyes. The ever-moving hands. The messy hair that refused to stay tied back. And the eyes tired, yes, but awake. Watching. She pressed a hand to her chest. "Thank you, sweetheart." Eli looked down, a flush rising on his cheeks. She reached out and gently touched the bracelet still on his wrist. "This is the best gift anyone's ever given me." After a moment, Eli whispered, barely audible, "You're nice." Evie froze, blinked, swallowed hard. "I try to be." He nodded, then picked up his sketch pad and walked away. She sat there long after the fire dimmed, his drawing still in her hands. Warmth bloomed in the quiet hollows of her heart. Places she had forgotten were still capable of feeling. And in that stillness, something beautiful had begun. She tucked the photograph delicately between the soft, worn pages of her notebook, quietly, almost reverently, the way someone might hide a treasure map, afraid to lose its magic. On the third evening, Miles descended from a loft carrying an old cardboard box labeled Simply June. Inside lay a folded, half-finished quilt. A strand of thread still dangled, suspended in time, from the last stitch like an interrupted breath. "My wife started this," he murmured, voice catching in the hush. "She always meant to finish it." Evie unfolded the fabric with a kind of tenderness usually reserved for sacred things. The cloth was lighter than what she typically used, sun-kissed yellows, whispering blues, soft cottons that seemed to remember laughter and lullabies. There was a gentleness stitched into it, feminine, hopeful. "She had a beautiful eye for color," Evie whispered. Miles nodded, something distant and aching in his gaze. "She used to say quilts were like prayers," he said. "The more pieces, the more someone had to say." Silence settled between them, not awkward but full, grief brushing against gratitude like old friends. In that pine-scented room, the quiet didn't press, it comforted, it held. By the end of the week, Evie had finished the quilt. It wasn't perfect. The corners were crooked, some stitches jagged and uneven, and a few threads showed through like scars. But it was real, forged from discarded fragments, made whole again. She laid it gently across the back of the couch, as though offering it to the soul of the house. That night, long after the children had drifted to sleep and the fire had lulled into a glowing hush, Miles picked up the quilt, unfolded it, and draped it across his shoulders. "Warm," he said softly. Evie smiled, a small breath of light in the dim. "That's the idea." Then, unexpectedly, he added, "You should sell them." She blinked. "The quilts. Handmade things," he said. "People still care about things with stories. Things made slow." She shook her head, reflexively. "I'm not ready." Miles didn't argue. He only replied, "You don't have to be ready. You just have to start." He didn't press. He simply left the words there, like a seed tucked into the soil, trusting the future. The next morning, Maddie was braiding her doll's hair with a leftover thread and suddenly asked, "Can we name it?" "Name what?" Evie asked. "The quilt," Maddie said matter-of-factly, as though it were obvious. "Quilts should have names." Evie tilted her head. "What would you name it?" Maddie paused, then smiled like sunlight breaking through winter. "Second chances." Evie felt her breath hitch. "Why that?" "Because it was old stuff before," Maddie said simply. "But now it's something good." Even Eli nodded slightly, as if it made perfect sense. That weekend, Jamie found an old account Evie hadn't touched in years and uploaded a picture of the quilt. He added a caption she hadn't written, but that made her eyes sting anyway. Made by my mom, who believes people and fabric both deserve a second chance. They didn't expect much. But on Monday morning, an order came in from a teacher in Oregon. 2 more followed by noon. Evie sat frozen in front of the screen, fingers hovering over the keyboard, unsure whether to cry or laugh. Miles passed behind her with his morning coffee, glanced at the screen, and smiled. Looks like you just started. That night, wrapped in the quilt her daughter named and her hand stitched, Evie sat by the fire. She whispered a prayer, not for more sales or success, but something quieter, more ancient. Thank you, she said to the flickering dark, for the pieces I thought I'd lost, and the hands that helped me sew them back together. Outside, the wind danced gently through the trees, but inside everything held. The storm came like a thief, unannounced, unforgiving. One moment the sky was soft silver, the next, clouds rolled in like bruises from the west. The wind howled through the trees in a voice that made even the birds go silent. By late afternoon, the snow wasn't falling. It was flying sideways. Inside the cabin, the lights flickered once, then died. Power's out, Miles said, checking the breaker. Grid's down. Will it be back soon? Evie asked, calm but taut. Not tonight, he said. Maybe not for a couple days. They've been behind since the last ice storm. Evie glanced at the kids. Maddie instinctively curled around baby Caleb, protective without being told. Jamie pressed close to the window, eyes watching the trees bend like old men under the weight of wind. Evie took a steady breath. We'll be okay. Miles nodded. We will, as long as we keep the fire going. He moved like a man used to handling storms, not with panic, but with quiet urgency. He loaded firewood, fetched extra blankets, filled pots before the pipes could freeze. The generator was dead. The warmth of their world now depended solely on patience, fire, and what was left in the pantry. Beans, oats, a bag of potatoes, some rice. Not abundance, but enough. What they didn't have was medicine. That night, Caleb began coughing. At first, shallow. By midnight, it rasped deep in his tiny lungs. Evie knew that sound. All mothers do. It wasn't panic, but it was warning. She wrapped him close, his small body pressed to hers, and rocked him gently by the fire while the others slept tangled in quilts nearby. Across from her, Miles was quietly sharpening a knife on a leather strap. Sounds bad, he said. I think it's bronchial. He's had it before. Needs the vapor rub. Maybe a warm compress. Maybe cough syrup if it gets worse. Miles nodded. I've got Vicks. And honey. But not cash for a trip to town. Evie added softly. He met her eyes. Neither do I. Then, without a word, he stood. Pulled on his coat. Where are you going? She asked. Woodpile, he replied. Willow, she said, rising to follow. I can help. Stay. Keep him warm. And with no drama or declaration, he stepped into the blizzard. The snow struck his face like open hands. The cold bit at his seams, but Miles didn't stop. He pushed through drifts up to his knees, dragging a wheelbarrow and gripping the old axe passed down from his father. By the time he reached the trees, his beard was ice, and his breath came in clouds. But still he swung. Each strike wasn't just for fire. It was for them. For the woman holding a sick child. For the boy learning to trust. For the girl who tied yarn on his son's wrist like a vow. For Eli. For every version of himself who once needed someone, and had no one. He chopped until his muscles screamed. Until his gloves tore. Until his hands bled. Inside, Evie whispered stories into Caleb's ear, half true, half magic, about golden threads and quilts that sang lullabies, about houses that didn't splinter when the wind howled. She sang softly. The melody cracked with worry, but carried through the dark. Sometime after midnight, the door groaned open. Miles returned, soaked, shaking, but dragging enough wood to last 3 days. You're frozen, Evie said, rising. I'm fine. No, you're not. She pulled off his gloves. His hands were torn, blistered. You did this for us. He looked at her, unreadable. Didn't feel like a choice. She led him to a chair, wrapped a towel around his shoulders, then sat before him and gently rubbed ointment into his hands. For the first time in weeks, the air between them felt not just safe, but sacred. The storm passed with the coming dawn. The power was still out, but the sun returned, spilling gold across the wooden floor. The cabin smelled of firewood, honey, and something healing. Caleb's cough had softened. Eli curled up, sketching in the margins of an old cookbook. Jamie built a fortress of snow bricks outside. Maddie and her sister braided doll dresses from leftover quilt fabric. Evie sat beside Miles at the table. When we're out of this, when we have enough, she said, I want to pay you back. Miles met her gaze. I'm not keeping score. I know, she whispered, but I am. He just nodded. Some debts aren't meant to be repaid, he said, just passed on. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his, not as a guest, not as a burden, but as someone who had begun to understand. Home wasn't something you earned. It was where someone kept the fire burning for you, even when it hurt. She hadn't meant to share it. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that let thoughts surface like ripples. The children slept. The fire was dying. Miles was outside fixing the door hinge. Evie sat with tea cooling in her hands, a notebook beside her, the same one filled with grocery lists, quilt sketches, and bedtime stories. But tonight, the pencil moved with purpose. She didn't plan it. The words just poured out. A letter. To no one in particular. Maybe to herself. Maybe to the woman she was 7 weeks ago, shivering in the snow. You don't know him yet, but there's a man who will stand between you and the worst version of the world. He won't promise anything. He won't fix everything. He'll just open a door, give you a coat, light a fire, and keep it going. You'll think it's nothing, but it will be everything. When she finished, her hand ached. She folded the letter, placed it in an envelope. No address, no stamp, meant to be thrown away. But Jamie found it the next day, mistook it for shipping materials, and it ended up mailed to a librarian named Cheryl Riggins. Cheryl read the letter, twice, then posted it online. By the end of the week, it had been shared over 12,000 times. Evie's inbox overflowed. I read your letter. I cried at my desk. You reminded me I still matter. We read it aloud in class. Radio stations, podcasts, a morning show. When she told Miles, he looked up from the cabinet door. I didn't mean to send it, she said. Maybe someone needed to read it, he replied. I feel exposed. Maybe, he said gently, or maybe you've just been seen. That night, Maddie curled up in the hallway with her doll wrapped in the Second Chances quilt. Mom, she asked, are we going to be famous now? Evie knelt. No, honey, we're just heard. What does that mean? Evie smoothed the doll's hair. It means when you speak, someone listens. And when you're quiet, someone still cares. 2 days later, a large envelope arrived. Inside was a letter from a woman named June Price, director of a nonprofit for single parents. We read your letter aloud. There wasn't a dry eye. We'd love to feature your story. The world needs more women like you, who stitch beauty from brokenness. Evie folded the letter slowly, hands trembling. Miles watched her, reading her face like scripture. You okay? He asked. She smiled, eyes wet but alight. I think I might actually be. That evening, after the children had drifted into sleep and the world had quieted to a hush, Evie stood before the fireplace, her silhouette glowing softly in the amber flicker of the flames. In her hands, she held the red yarn bracelet, worn, familiar, and now returned. Eli had quietly placed it on the table that morning, accompanied by a small, handwritten note. You can give this to someone else who needs safe. It undid her, not in sorrow, but in the kind of ache that cracks something open and lets in light. Clutching the bracelet to her chest, her voice was a whisper meant only for the quiet room and the spirits that lingered in warmth. Thank you for turning what I thought was an ending into someone else's beginning. Just then, Miles entered, the door clicking shut softly behind him. She turned to face him, meeting his gaze not with timidity or apology, but with a newfound steadiness that trembled with quiet resolve. "I think I'm ready," she said, her voice carrying the weight of seasons endured. Miles tilted his head gently. "For what?" "To tell our story," she answered. And then, after a beat, she stepped closer. "Yours. Mine. The kids. Eli. The quilts. The firewood. The letter. All of it." He didn't speak at first. He simply looked at her as if seeing her fully for the very first time. Then, slowly, he reached for her hand, the roughness of his fingers grazing hers. "You're the bravest person I know." She shook her head, tears caught in the curve of her smile. "No, just a woman who ran out of excuses not to hope." The knock came on a Tuesday morning. The snow had melted into crusts of stubborn ice, and the air carried the faint, promising scent of early spring. Inside the cabin, the morning was peaceful. Evie stood in the kitchen, her apron dusted with flour, helping Maddie roll out biscuit dough while baby Caleb napped and the other children bent over homeschool assignments at the long wooden table. Outside, Miles was chopping kindling, sleeves pushed up, shoulders glistening with sweat under the pale gold of the sun. The rhythm of his axe was steady, comforting. The knock was firm, neither loud nor timid. A deliberate interruption. Wiping her hands on a dish towel, Evie walked to the door and opened it. Two figures stood on the porch. The first was instantly recognizable, Dolores Langford, her former mother-in-law, wrapped tightly in a camel-colored coat and gripping her leather purse as though it were armor. Beside her stood a man in a tailored black overcoat, spectacles perched precisely on his nose. An attorney, unmistakably. Evie's breath caught in her throat. "Good morning," Dolores said, her voice stiff and polished. "We need to talk." Evie didn't move. Her fingers curled around the edge of the door, knuckles white. "May we come in?" the attorney asked. She shook her head. "No, but you can say what you came to say." The man nodded, clearing his throat. "I'm Robert Keene, legal counsel for Mrs. Langford. We're here to notify you that she is filing for full legal guardianship of all 4 minors." "Custody," Evie echoed, the word falling flat and hollow from her lips. Dolores's tone was cold steel. "Yes, as next of kin to the children's deceased father, we believe it's in their best interest. We gave you a chance, Evie, but dragging those kids into the wilderness to live with a man you barely know, that's not parenting. That's negligence." Evie felt the heat rise in her throat. "You left us in the snow." Dolores's expression didn't waver. "You left Mark first." Before she could speak, the familiar sound of boots approached. Miles stepped up beside her, without needing to ask what was going on. His presence was a wall, calm, unmoving. "Is there a court date?" he asked. 3 weeks from today," the attorney replied. "You'll receive official notice within 48 hours." Without waiting for further words, they turned and left. Evie stood frozen, the wind rushing past her into the cabin like an omen. Miles gently shut the door behind them. "I'm sorry," he said. "This is going to be a fight." Evie looked up at him, her jaw tight with resolve. "Then we fight." The following days blurred into a whirlwind of legal aid hotlines, forms, statements, copies of documents, and sleepless nights. Evie's hands ached from writing. Every time she looked at her children, something tightened in her chest like a thread pulled too taut. "How do you prove a home is a home?" she whispered one night, head bowed at the kitchen table. Miles leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You don't prove it," he said softly. "You show it." She lifted her eyes, hollow with worry. "How?" "By letting the people who've really seen it stand beside you." The courthouse was cold, gray, and echoing with the kind of silence designed to make hearts small. Evie sat outside the courtroom, petition in her hands, trembling. Miles sat on one side, Eli on the other, quiet with his sketchpad in his lap. Dolores arrived with posture like iron, pearls gleaming at her neck. Her brother-in-law, long unseen, flanked her, along with a lawyer. Inside, the courtroom was hushed. The judge, an older woman with glasses low on her nose, looked on with quiet intensity. The only sound was the soft clatter of the stenographer's keys. Evie told her story with simplicity, not theatrics. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Her voice was steady, shaped by truth. Then Miles took the stand. Calm, respectful. When asked why he had taken in a woman and 4 children he barely knew, his answer was clear. Because no one else did. The opposing lawyer pushed harder. So, it wasn't a romantic relationship at the time. No, Miles replied. It was an act of basic human decency. And now, has that changed? He looked at Evie. A pause. Yes, but this isn't about that. This is about 4 children who finally smile in the morning, who sleep through the night. The judge peered at him. And what do you get out of this? Miles didn't hesitate. Family. Then came the unexpected. The judge turned to Eli. Young man, she said gently, would you like to speak? Evie's heart stopped. Eli nodded. He stood, walked to the front, and handed the judge a folded piece of paper. She opened it. 7 figures stood drawn in colored pencil. Evie Miles, the 4 children, and Eli himself. They were standing in front of the cabin. Firelight glowed from the windows. A dog, still a dream, slept on the porch. Faces were smiling. Hands were linked. And above them, in bright red crayon, one word floated like a banner. Home. The judge blinked, then smiled. That's all I need. The petition was denied. Full custody remained with Evie. The court declared confidence in her ability to raise her children in a loving, stable environment. Dolores said nothing as she left. Outside on the courthouse steps, Evie held 2 of her children's hands. Miles stood beside her, Eli leaning into his side. The wind stirred gently around them, no longer cold, just clean. I didn't expect that, Evie whispered. Miles smiled at the mountains. I did. How? Because when people see love in its quietest form, they stop needing to be convinced. Spring crept into Pine Hollow with reverence, like someone gently knocking before entering. It arrived in soft-spoken ways. Birdsong at dawn, the retreat of snow into muddy patches, the scent of pine warmed by sunlight. Inside the cabin, the season unfurled in laughter and renewal. Jamie no longer asked if they were staying. Maddie hummed again, little songs from memory. Caleb giggled so deeply that even the floorboards felt lighter. And Eli, he no longer kept to the shadows. He sat barefoot on the porch, sketchbook in lap, his red yarn bracelet tied gently around his ankle, his quiet tether to everything that mattered. One afternoon, while the children played, Miles carried a hand-built bench beneath the sugar maple where new green leaves had begun to peek. The bench was smooth, lovingly crafted, and on the slat he had carved a single word: stillness. Evie watched him from the porch. That for me? She called. He looked up, grinning. It's for whoever needs to remember that not moving is still a kind of progress. She joined him, brushing sawdust from his shoulder, and sat. It's beautiful, she whispered. They sat in silence, rich, full silence, the kind that speaks more than words ever could. You ever think you'd end up here? She asked. Miles shook his head. I thought I'd be alone by now. Just Eli and I lost in the trees. She traced the bench's grain with her fingertips. And now, he said quietly, there are fingerprints on every surface of my life, and I've never felt more whole. Her smile trembled. I keep waiting for it to fall apart. Like it's too good. Like we didn't earn this. He reached for her hand. It's not about earning. It's about receiving. Evie looked at him, voice small. Can I ask you something honest? Always. Are you afraid of starting over? Miles stared into the canopy above. Then, softly, I used to be. But then you all showed up, and I realized starting over doesn't mean going back. It means building something new, with everything you've carried forward. She smiled. Then maybe I'm ready. For what? He asked. To build. That evening, Jamie handed her an envelope. Found this in the mailbox. Inside was a letter from a regional magazine. Her story, the one she hadn't even meant to send, had been published. Alongside it, a feature on her quilts and the journey behind them. Her photograph was there too, Caleb on her hip, Maddie at her feet, the cabin behind them. Evie read it 3 times, then held it to her chest. Maddie ran up with arms full of dandelions. "They're weeds," she said breathless. "But they're pretty." Evie kissed her forehead. "Then they're perfect." That night, Miles poured 2 glasses of apple cider. "To spring," he said. Evie clinked her glass. "To second chances." Later, beneath the tree, they sat on the bench together. Miles said nothing. He didn't need to. Evie leaned her head on his shoulder. "You think people like us, people who break and mend and break again, you think we get forever?" He wrapped an arm around her. "I think we get now. And if we're lucky, now keep showing up every morning." Spring deepened, and when the town held its annual gathering, Evie and her family were no longer whispered names on the edges of loss. They were invited, celebrated, under a banner that read stories and stitching. They laid out quilts stitched from second chances. Maddie sold bookmarks made from scraps. Jamie demonstrated finger-chaining yarn. Caleb toddled with lavender sachets. And for the first time, in a town where they had once arrived as ghosts, they stood visible. They stood whole. They stood home. By late afternoon, the day had worn its edges thin. The crowd had begun to drift, some laughing, others clasping warm cider cups, and children weaving between tables like scattered birds. It had been a good day. Steady, comforting. Evie was folding a withered tablecloth, her fingers moving in practiced rhythm, when a sound cut through the hum of conversation. A banjo. Not just any banjo. That banjo. The one that hadn't sung in years. The one that used to be stitched to Miles's soul. Evie turned, heart halting mid-beat. There he was. Miles, standing on the small, makeshift stage beneath a tangle of bare string lights, holding that old wooden instrument as if it had grown from his own ribs. He hadn't played in public since, well, since before Eli had been born. Maybe not even since the day his wife died. Music, once the lifeblood of his spirit, had gone silent with her. Or so Evie had believed. He strummed once, just once, and then raised his eyes to the crowd. "I'm not much for words," he said into the mic, voice even clear. "But lately, someone's been teaching me how to show up anyway." He didn't say her name. He didn't need to. Every breath between the strings said it. Then he played. It wasn't a love song, not in the way roses or rings might suggest. It was something older, something elemental, the kind of melody that rises from soil, not pages. It sounded like firewood cracking open, like wind rushing through pine, like a second cup of coffee passed across a kitchen table. No words exchanged, only warmth. From the side of the stage, Eli stood watching, small box clutched tightly in his hands, eyes wide and bright with something like pride. When the final note faded, the applause came, soft at first, tentative, then a slow, rising tide of warmth, as if everyone there knew they'd witnessed something sacred. Evie's hands trembled. She hadn't even realized she was crying until Maddie tugged at her dress and whispered, "Mom, look." Eli was coming toward her, step by sure step. He stopped just before her and held out the box. It was wooden, lovingly carved, the top sanded smooth. One word etched into the lid, "us." She opened it with shaking hands. Inside, a small square of red yarn, her first bracelet, preserved like a sacred heirloom. Beside it, neatly folded, was a new quilt square. It was stitched from 2 different fabrics, one from her tattered old coat, the other from the flannel of Miles's work shirt. Underneath lay a handwritten note in Eli's careful scrawl. "You made us warm. Dad made us safe. Now we're not pieces anymore." Evie sank onto the edge of the stage, clutching the box to her chest, mascara running down her cheeks, tears carving paths of grateful disbelief. Home, she realized, wasn't something she found. It was something that had slowly, quietly grown around her, like trees bowing toward a stubborn flame that refused to die. That night, after the children had drifted into dreams, she and Miles stood alone in the quiet kitchen. The banjo rested again in the corner, its song spent but lingering in the air like candle smoke. "I didn't know you'd do that," she whispered. Miles gave a half-smile. "Neither did I." She held the box in both hands, as if it might float away. Why now? He looked at her, his eyes softer than his voice. Because I thought I was just surviving until I realized I wasn't alone anymore. He reached into his pocket and drew out a small, folded slip of paper. His fingers hesitated. I was going to wait, he murmured, but I don't want any more. She opened it. Not a poem, not a speech, just one line. I'd like to keep building life with you, one stitch at a time. She looked up, breath caught in her chest. I don't have a ring, he said quickly. I don't have a plan. I just have this. Us. And I know it's messy and late, and maybe it's not the way it's supposed to look. She stopped him with a kiss. Soft, certain, not rushed. When she pulled back, her eyes shimmered. I don't need a ring or a plan, she whispered. I just need the man who stood in a snowstorm and kept the fire going. Later, when they curled beneath the covers, the box with the red yarn rested on the nightstand. Outside, the spring wind whispered through the trees, and for the first time in what felt like lifetimes, neither of them dreamed of the past. They dreamed forward. By late May, the cabin hadn't changed much in structure. The north side of the roof still sagged. The pantry door stuck when the weather turned humid, and the porch creaked every third step. But something inside had transformed. The garden behind the cabin had erupted with life, half wild, half tended. Maddie's marigolds bloomed beside Miles's onions. Caleb's tiny footprints always showed up where no one expected them. A hammock now swung gently between two pines. Wind chimes made from old spoons and buttons danced in the breeze. And above the door, a handmade sign had been nailed with care. This house wasn't built with walls. It was built with people who stayed. Evie read that sign every morning, sometimes with coffee, sometimes barefoot, sometimes with a child draped across her hip, always with quiet awe. It had been 4 months since the snow. For months since she'd been cast out, deemed unworthy. For months since Miles had looked at her and her children and, without a single word, said, I choose you anyway. And somehow, in choosing one another, they had all found their way home. The quilts were selling faster than ever now, not because they were perfect, but precisely because they weren't. Letters came in. Strangers. Friends of strangers. From towns Evie couldn't even point on a map. One wrote, This blanket feels like my grandmother's laugh. Another, I gave this to my daughter when her marriage ended. She said it helped her breathe again. Every note felt like a stitch in something bigger than fabric, something like healing. One afternoon, Jamie looked up and asked, Do you think we could teach other kids how to quilt? Kids like we were, he added, sheepishly. Evie's heart swelled. You are kids, she teased. Yeah, Jamie grinned. But we're different now. And they were. That same week, a letter came from Miles. It was from the school district. They'd heard about his work with Evie's family, his quiet efforts for local food pantries. They wanted to offer him a part-time position, leading a woodcraft program for at-risk youth. He stared at the letter for a long time. I haven't taught anyone anything in 10 years, he said. Evie reached for his hand, gently. You've been teaching us every day. He took the job, not for praise, not for purpose, but because, finally, he believed he had something to give. On the first day of June, they hosted a picnic behind the cabin. Just 12 guests, neighbors, 2 homeschool moms, a young couple who'd once bought a quilt for their foster daughter, and Cheryl, the librarian who had unknowingly published Evie's letter all those months ago. They came with folding chairs and lemonade. No one wore shoes. The kids ran barefoot through sprinklers and painted rocks. Music poured from a cracked speaker, and at one point, Miles picked up the banjo again. No one asked him to stop. As the sun dipped low, Cheryl pulled Evie aside. I've read a lot of stories, she said, but yours, it's the only one that made me believe safe isn't something we find. It's something we build. Evie smiled, eyes glistening. Thank you, she said, but I didn't build it alone. That evening, under a sky brushed in twilight, the children lay tangled in quilts on the grass. Evie and Miles sat shoulder to shoulder on the porch swing, silence resting between them like a hymn. "You ever think we'd end up here?" she asked softly. Miles shook his head. "No, but now, I can't imagine being anywhere else." She rested her head on his shoulder. "What do you think made it work?" He thought for a long moment. "We didn't try to fix each other," he said. "We just stayed long enough for the broken parts to feel safe again." Evie closed her eyes. "That's what home is, isn't it?" she whispered. "Not the roof, not the walls, just the staying." Miles nodded. And the listening, the choosing, again and again. As stars winked into the sky, Eli padded onto the porch barefoot. His red yarn bracelet had faded to the color of old clay. He climbed into Miles's lap, curling against his chest like a breath finding its rhythm. Evie looked at them, man and boy, not tied by blood, but by something far stronger. Then she turned to the children sleeping under the quilt of dusk, the trees swaying above them like a lullaby sung by the earth itself. And she thought, this is the miracle. Not that we were rescued, but that we were rebuilt, thread by thread, choice by choice, breath by breath. Inside, on the living room wall, hung Eli's latest drawing. 7 figures, same faces, same hands joined. But behind them, instead of a house, stood a quilt, large, luminous, each panel stitched with memory, a red bracelet, a banjo, a box carved with us. Above it, in careful block letters, he'd written, "Our family isn't perfect, but it's ours." And for the first time, ever and always, that was enough. Maybe that's what home truly is. Not a place we find, but a space we choose. Again and again, through love, through kindness, through the quiet courage of staying. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below. Your presence here, truly, is already a miracle. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, gentle, honest, and full of hope, this little corner of YouTube will always be open to you.